Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you might be. Um, I, my name is Chuck. I'm a codependent, and I came into Codependence Anonymous about 32 years ago, just a little bit over 32 years ago. I, along with several other therapists that I knew here in Arizona, we're working in a treatment set. We were all working in different treatment centers, and I got to know these other therapists from sending clients to their programs and them sending clients to my programs. And then over time, what we discovered is that we had a very similar characteristic in our personal lives. And that was our personal lives were a mess. Many of us were married. I was married at the time, and a few of the other people early on in CODA were also married, and we were really struggling at home. We were going to our jobs every day, helping people deal with their substance abuse issues and family issues and so forth. And then we'd go home and be miserable. And so in discussing this openly with a few of these therapists, a couple of them, some of you already know our founders, got together and said, you know, we need to start meeting, talking about this. And thereabouts, CODA came to be a few years earlier, but came to be a program that has grown and continued to grow around the world. I've been a very fortunate and blessed member that I've been able to participate. I recently returned from Mexico. I was living in Mexico for about the last 6 years. And about a year and a half ago, I lost my son and my wife to COVID. And I had not been attending CODA meetings. There were none in the area that I was living in. I was not familiar at all with Zoom. As a matter of fact, I considered myself a Zoom virgin until today. This is my first Zoom experience. And so bear with me. I might be a little bit awkward initially because I've never done a presentation of this sort. I grew up in the military. I went into the military. I was a military instructor. I went to instructor school and master instructor school. So I've always felt very confident and comfortable in a room full of people. And I've spoken in rooms full of people from 5 to 5,000. And it never intimidated me like it does many. And so I began traveling all over the country for my treatment center that I worked with, speaking from New York City all the way down to LA and from North Dakota down to Texas. And spoke mostly on youth and youth sobriety and developing programs like that. I maintained my recovery in CODA because I found out that every time I went away from CODA, I began to return. I have a big forgetter that lives on my shoulders. And every time I would stay away from it for any length of time, including when I moved to Mexico for that period of time, this big forgetter on my shoulders quit remembering what I'd learned in these programs and these meetings for many years. And even though I had the readings with me, I wasn't reading them. I was depending on knowledge. And anybody that knows anything about recovering people, knowledge avails us nothing. I learned a lot from reading books. I learned a lot from attending meetings, but I found out that when I got away from recovering people like yourselves, I began to slip back into old behaviors and old attitudes and old actions that were very destructive for me as well as the people that were around me. And so I'm grateful that I'm back in the United States. I'm especially grateful that I found a loving, caring group of codependents that have opened arms and accepted me back into their meetings. And I hope to continue to be a part of this program throughout the rest of my life and give back what I've been freely receiving here for so many years. I agreed to talk about a presentation I recently did for CODA here in Arizona, which is about the facts of feelings. And I'm very adamant about teaching about feelings because I grew up in a family that was, there was one feeling, and that was rage and anger. And that came out typically against anybody who crossed the line. And that line was about anything that kids just being kids, from laughing too loudly, from being too goofy. I was in a military home, and it was very staunch and strict, and we just weren't allowed to enjoy ourselves, nor were we allowed to have any other feelings. If we were to get angry and express that in any way, we were knocked to the floor pretty quickly. And so I learned that feelings were just absolutely unacceptable. And I learned to hide every single one of my feelings. And the only time I remember later on in my adolescence that I could express feelings was use alcohol and other substances. And that allowed me to express myself openly, because when I would get drunk, I was John Wayne, John Travolta, and Tom Cruise all at once. And occasionally people would put me in my place because I'm just a little guy and I thought I was King Kong. So, but I learned that those substances allowed me an expression that I just couldn't come by naturally. Fortunately, I had stopped using alcohol 40 years ago, and I know I only look 32 years old, but I stopped using alcohol about 40 years ago when I went into another 12-step program. And those people became my real family. I haven't spoke with my family since I went into that program. They thought that I was thinking I was better then, especially when I became a counselor. Then I was really cast out. How dare you? We don't talk about family secrets. We don't ever mention anything bad about the homes that we grew up in. And so all of a sudden I'm in counseling. I'm becoming a counselor. I'm receiving counseling myself, which I did for the first 20 years, literally 20 years. When I got into recovery, I spent 20 years in male groups as well as one-to-one counseling. And if it wasn't for that recovery and in conjunction with CODA, I probably wouldn't be with you here today. My first suicide attempt, I was only 11 years old. And then again in my 20s, I tried again. And so I was miserable, and I was severely depressed, and I didn't even know what depression was, but I just began to shut off from the world unless I had some kind of alcohol or substance that would allow me to speak openly and outwardly. So not having any feelings, I found out that I didn't really have any way to survive life. And that's all I was doing. I was barely surviving. I didn't know how to relate to people, but especially I didn't know how to relate in intimate relationships, the kind that you have at home with your significant other, the kind that you have with your children. I was absolutely unavailable, is what I was always hearing from significant others in my life. And I've had a few actually, and they always, at the end of the day, came down to me and said, you know, you're just unavailable. You're so detached from me. You're just not there for me. And I just didn't know what that meant. And so the more time that I spent around CODA and the more time that I spent around finding out about recovery, and in my 20s and 30s, I read, I think, probably every self-help book that was out there from every author that I could find. And again, all of that knowledge that I was gaining was helpful to me as a counselor, but it was not helpful to me personally. And that's the old phrase that knowledge availed me nothing. I could not find my way around myself and within myself. If anything that I was detached from, it was me, my internal self, my spiritual self. I was completely detached from. I had a tremendous amount of self-hatred and self-anger, and I didn't know where that came from. So as I got into recovery, these things became more clear. But what I found out that sped up my recovery is being able to identify my feelings, being able to express my feelings with safe people in safe situations. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to first tell you what I don't believe are feelings, and that's emotions. Emotions are more of a state of being. And I'll give you an example. There's states of rage where a person goes into a state of rage, and states of emotions can last from minutes to hours and sometimes lifetimes. And so states of emotions, a state of rage is a situation where I feel terrified, and so I act out rather than show my fear in a rageful way, and it keeps people away. I did that whole rage thing in my 20s and even younger. State of depression, I had depressed all of my feelings. I didn't have the ability to feel sad or pain. It was unacceptable in my home. So I depressed all of that and became depressed. Was put on depression medications when I was very young. They said that I had a brain imbalance. No, I had a life imbalance is what I had. And anybody that came out of that family would have understood what I was talking about, like maybe some of you do. I also lived in a state of terror, an emotional state of terror. I didn't let you know that. A matter of fact, I lived a life trying to prove to the rest of the world that I wasn't terrified of nothing. I was one of the first base jumpers, one of the first 6 base jumpers in the world. There's several 100,000 now of us. And base jumping started here in Arizona, where we jumped off. B was for buildings, A was for antennas, S was for spans such as bridges and dams, and E was for earth. Once you jumped off of each one of those items, you had a base number. And so I started base jumping with a buddy of mine that was my skydiving partner. That was also an activity that I involved myself in. And I did these things to prove to myself I wasn't afraid of anything, but more importantly, is to prove to the world that I wasn't afraid of anything. And that was coming out of my state of terror. State of loneliness. I had all kinds of friends. I've always been very social. I've always had just a litany of friends. And yet I was one of the most lonely people that I'd ever met. I'd go home by myself, and sometimes I would even cry at night because I felt so detached from the world. And I felt like if people really knew me, they wouldn't want to hang around me anyways. And so I had this facade that I developed throughout my childhood to keep people close, but not too close. As I said, those emotional states can last hours, they can last days, and even lifetimes. And for my emotional states, what I had to do, first of all, is recognize what they were. Once I had that recognition, then I had to get into some resolution. For me, it involved therapy. For some people, it involves 12-step recovery. For some people, it involves having a safe person in their life that they can talk to. I had all of those things, and I was very blessed. Some of the trauma that occurred in my childhood, I talk about the trauma bond. That when a perpetrator, and that perpetrator can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. It can be a parent, it can be an uncle, it can be a family member, it can be somebody in the community, it can even be a priest or a pastor. And if that higher power, and by higher power, I mean they had more power than me. I was a child. My parents were my first higher power. And so since I was abused from my parents, my stepfather, I had a trauma bond with them. When a perpetrator perpetrates somebody, they put shame into them. They make them feel less than, as if they deserved it. Even people that are raped and know that it wasn't their fault that they were raped still walk away with tremendous shame. It includes going into the shower right away and showering off. When I was very young, I had a drunk mother who did some very terrible things to me while she was drunk. And those things were manifest themselves into shame. So I was very detached from my own sexuality because any kind of sexuality in my life was shame-based. And so I didn't know how to have intimate relationships. So that trauma bond that I had to be confronted. It had to first be recognized and had to be confronted in years and years of therapy. And so I'm a very strong supporter, not just because I was a counselor for so many years, but because I believe that some people need that personal help. CODA helped me identify a lot of those issues that I needed to get professional help with. Thank God there was people in CODA back when I first came in that talked a lot about seeking outside help. because for me, I needed the additional outside help. So getting back to feelings, if it's not an emotional state, the way that I deal with emotional state and the way that I deal with life today is I'm very, very open and very, very candid about my feelings. And as I talk today, I'm going to try to explain to you why. Every single feeling that I was born with, that I believe all of us were born with, and I'm going to categorize most feelings down to 7. I call it mad, sad, glad, pain, fear, guilt, and shame. And I've developed these 7 feelings over the years in my life, as well as the lives of my own children. In my home growing up, I would demand that we met every single week. We'd sit in our living room. We'd sit in a circle in my living room, and I would have my 4 kids, myself and my spouse at the time, and we would go around, and each one of us would talk about our week and connect specific feelings of these 7 feelings in our lives. To this day, all of my children have very successful relationships. They have wonderful relationships with their own kids. And I find, and they tell me, the biggest reason for that is they learn to communicate these feelings. They can now express themselves rather than bottle them up and wait for an explosion later on in life or in depression. So the feelings I've broken down to, we're going to be showing a slide here in a moment, is these 7 basic feelings can be categorized as mad, sad, glad, fear, guilt, shame, and pain. And I want to say that I realize that there's a lot more feelings that we could all express in our lives, and most of us do. But this list simply points out everyday feelings that I believe each one of us is born with. We all have the capacity to feel these at birth. However, depending on the environments that we grew up in, much like my environment that I grew up in, I learned that these feelings were unacceptable and that there was consequences if you shared them. So I learned to hide them from my family of origin. I learned to hide them from people that I was in a relationship with because I was terrified of getting hurt. I had learned in the first 18 years of my life by expressing these feelings that I could get even more hurt than I was hurting already. And so I learned to just put them down deep inside of myself. And as I grew older, I began to learn that if I didn't express these, there was consequences, which I'll go into a minute. So I want to break down each one of these feelings and talk about them specifically. Starting with the feeling of being mad. It's a common feeling. Most of us know it. We've experienced it. There's a lot of ways to say that I'm mad. And I put these synonyms up there for every one of these feelings because I think it's really important that we understand that mad can be expressed through a lot of different words. We don't have to just say I'm mad. It can be I'm feeling very put out. I'm being provoked. I feel antagonized by you. I feel angry or pissed, miffed, annoyed, irritated, irked, vexed, exasperated. And that list can go on. I'm sure that some of you are aware of that. But mad has the ability to be mad has a very, very important and valuable purpose. And that purpose is whenever I'm mad, I get strength from that. I'll give you an example. If I'm procrastinating something in my life, and to, let's say my family, it's important, my kids or my wife, it's important that I accomplish this particular thing. But I just continue to put it on hold and I procrastinate. You guys have probably never procrastinated. But as I procrastinated specific things in my life, simple stuff like mowing the lawn, then once I go out there and the lawn's 4 times higher than it should be and the lawnmower keeps turning off because the grass is too thick, I'm mad because I procrastinated. Anger comes out of me sometimes when I feel like I'm being abused or I feel like somebody's perpetrating in my life. I'll put up my walls and I'll become mad rather than just express myself. However, that strength that I get from expressing my anger is I get more self-confident. I'll feel more strength in who I am as a person. My esteem is increased as a result of the ability to be mad. And again, I'm not talking about the emotional state of rage. I'm talking about allowing myself to just express that I'm angry about something that just took place. Somebody's inappropriate behavior, my own inappropriate behavior. How many times have we been mad at ourselves? I know I've been mad at myself and spent a lot of time, a lot of years being mad at myself. As I continued to grow in my recovery, I found out that anger had a purpose, and that purpose is that it gave me strength. The next feeling I'd like to talk about is being sad. This particular feeling I became very, very familiar with. I grew up, children at 11 years old shouldn't be contemplating suicide. And unfortunately, children nowadays, and many of them nowadays in the United States, suicide is at an all-time high for adolescents, which is very, very sad in and of itself. But I found that the sadness that I had was coming out of a result of the life that I was living while I was at home, but also carried into my adulthood. But I didn't know why I was sad. I would cover my sadness up with that emotional rage or that emotional anger. And so I would detach from any kind of sadness. Being heartbroken, everybody's going to experience it. And being in mourning, everybody's going to experience it. Sadness will turn into depression. It'll turn into being bitter. It'll turn into being a very sarcastic person unless sadness is expressed. Sadness is another one of those feelings that I need to express. I need to be able to cry as a man. I need to be able to have people around me that will comfort me when I'm sad, when I express my sadness. And the reason that sadness is so important is I will have no emotional healing unless I have the ability to express my sadness. If all I do is put the sadness down within me and keep it inside of me, there is no emotional healing. And if there's no emotional healing, then I begin to act out sideways in passive aggressive manners, or I begin to become depressed and go to a doctor who will provide me antidepressants. And I'm not saying that everybody should get off antidepressants once they recognize they're sad. No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that sadness, a lot of times, or repressed sadness, turns into depression. Once we confront that sadness and express that sadness, and sometimes the sadness took place over a myriad of years. And so that sadness may not be dealt with in one counseling session or one CODA meeting. It may take years to express that sadness. I know it did for me. The more that I began to recognize in my CODA recovery that I came from a dysfunctional family, the more sadness I found out that I needed to learn how to express. Our next feeling is being glad. Now that would seem simple, right? Easy to be glad, easy to be happy. It was not easy for me to be happy and to experience gladness in my life. It was just as difficult as it was all the rest of the feeling. This was a very difficult feeling. I did not feel glad. It's hard to feel glad if you're depressed all the time, or if you're in pain all the time, or you're sad all the time. However, as I mentioned earlier, I would use substances in order to find this happiness, because without those substances, without addictive relationships, you know how you get that initial adrenaline, that rush from a brand new relationship. Oh, wow, this person likes me, or this person loves me. And I used to be addicted to getting into relationships. I called them 90-day wonders. The first 90 days were great, and then I'd wonder why I'm in it, because I needed to move on to the next in order to find that addictive sense, that adrenaline rush, that the endorphin rush that I would get from a brand new relationship and having somebody that was showing interest in me. And so that gladness for me was an opportunity to have happiness and joy in my life. I know that when I repressed my gladness, when I became militaristic, as I said, I grew up in a military family. There wasn't a lot of joyfulness in my family. And then I went into the military. And I was a very staunch believer in serving your country. But the sad part about that was is as I became a military person, I found less and less time to be glad. Unless I was out with my friends getting drunk, I found less and less time to be happy. Everything was serious all the time, everywhere. And I was reliving my childhood just as a young adult. I was unavailable to anybody, and I did not know how to be happy or joyful when I was around them. People would take trips and they'd go with their families on these outings, and they would just show so much joy. And I used to be so jealous of that. Especially, I hated holidays. I couldn't stand being around the holidays because there was all these families and all this joyfulness, and I resented it. I didn't know how to have that. It wasn't a part of my life. As I continued on in my recovery in Coda and being a clean and sober person in Coda, I found out that I did have joy in my heart. I did have happiness. I did begin to find some fortunate and contentment in my life because I found gratitude. I began to discover gratitude, which brought me a lot of joy in and of itself. I was told by a sponsor early on, make a gratitude list. And I just looked at him with a very puzzled look and said, a what list? I didn't have any gratitude early on in recovery. Grateful for what? You know, don't you know that I'm a victim? Don't you know what I went through? And in my head, I acted out that victimization. I lived that life. I had people say to me, you got to quit being a victim. And that would really make me mad. So you'd feel like a victim too if you went through what I went through, you know. And so I justified my victimization and my attitudes. But as I began to understand gratitude and literally have to write out gratitude lists, what I discovered was it brought me joy. When I began to recognize what I did have and what my higher power had carried me through and lovingly helped me through, my gratitude began to grow. And to this day, I have a tremendous amount to be grateful for. And part of my ritual, my life ritual today, is every single night, if I made it through that day and I'm getting into bed, I get on my knees. That's just how I was taught in the program, and say my prayer. Part of my gratitude is simple, is that I am grateful to you that you gave me another day, my higher power. And so I always want to remember that gratitude. It provides a tremendous amount of happiness and joy. Our next feeling, fear. Most of you have probably never been terrified or lived in fear. I know I have. I grew up, as another program taught me, with 1,000 forms of fear of everything. And as I said earlier, I had to live a life about being a hardened military man, or jumping off of buildings and bridges with a parachute on my back, or jumping out of planes, or just doing crazy stuff to let the world know I wasn't afraid of anything, when internally I was terrified of the world around me. I was terrified of being found out. I was fearful of success. I was fearful of failure. I was fearful of everything, relationships. And yet I mask it rather than express it and be open and honest about it. That was unacceptable in the life that I came from. You never, ever admitted that you were afraid. Never. It was unacceptable. As a result of living that life in fear, I began to make very stupid, foolish decisions in my life, like obsessively drinking and drugging, like getting in very unhealthy relationships. As I began to work through my fear, what I found that it provided me was wisdom. I found that fear gives me the opportunity to become wiser as a human being. And that is, if I face my fears rather than go around them or go over them, go through my fear, acknowledge that it's there. I use fear as an acronym. Forget everything and run. Some people use a different word for that F, but not on Zoom, we don't. So it's also false expectations appearing real. A couple of acronyms for that word that are very, very appropriate for my life and how I lived my life prior to recovery is that today I can admit that when I'm afraid, And I get afraid a lot. I've got things in my life right now that are causing a tremendous amount of fear. But I've got people in my life that I talk to about these things and when I'm experiencing those. Fear can also come out in different ways as just self-doubt, being apprehensive about taking the next step in a relationship or taking the next step. Simple things like committing to buying a home. I mean, I was terrified of owning my own home, years ago. That scared me to death because I thought, oh my gosh, now I'm committed to this. Now I've got responsibilities, and I was afraid of being responsible because I had been told that I'm irresponsible all my life. So fear is something that I can work through. And when I do, I get smarter because of it. I learn about life and not to be so afraid of whatever it is that I just had to confront. Nextly, we have guilt. Anybody ever feel guilt? I remember when I first went to 12-step program, they taught me the Al-Anon way, which was throwing my hand on my forehead, leaning back. We were guilty just to exist. I had somebody in our conference the other day that we had where somebody said, because of the faith that I grew up in, we were taught from birth to be guilty. And I was like, I really related to that. I remember not wanting to go home because I was sure that I had done something wrong that I was going to be in trouble for. I was sure of it. Guilt is not about who you are. Guilt is about what we've done. And as long as I'm willing to acknowledge that I am imperfect and therefore I will make mistakes and therefore I am guilty sometimes, and that I became much more of a mature adult if I'm willing to admit my guilt when I make a mistake or somebody says I've harmed them, and I own it and I accept it, I acknowledge that. And that way I can learn to ask for forgiveness. I found out a long time ago through the therapist that I was working for, is he said, you don't have to forgive anybody unless they ask for your forgiveness. And that was very powerful to me. And he says, Jesus, even back in the day, said, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And it was like he wasn't looking at the people saying, I forgive you. They weren't asking for his forgiveness. I have to have the mindset to be willing to forgive and understanding that other people are going to make mistakes too, like myself. If I don't acknowledge my own guilt, what happens to me is I begin to repeat the behaviors that I did to cause me guilt in the first place. For instance, the first time I got intoxicated and I fell in a sewage ditch. I was living in Taiwan. They had open sewage ditches. I was 13 years old and I fell in this ditch and I went home, and there was no way not to smell me. You smell for about 3 days. It's like being sprayed by a skunk. You just don't get rid of that smell very easily. And so I went home, I showered, cleaned up, went out, sat down at the dinner table, and the first thing they said was, where in the hell have you been? It was like the smell just permeated from the skin. And I just said, I fell in a benjo ditch. And it was because I went out and got drunk. And I wasn't going to tell him that part. I just wanted to acknowledge that I had accidentally slipped and fell in a benjo ditch. And it's just, I felt guilty. I just didn't want to acknowledge it. I also know that if I can't acknowledge my guilt, I have no moral compass. I have no consciousness. I'm not conscious about how anybody else feels, and I'm not conscious about what I've done. So by accepting my guilt, acknowledging it, and asking for forgiveness for my mistakes, I develop a moral code that I try to live by today, that has been reinforced and taught to me over the years in my recovery, that I have a responsibility not just to myself, but to other people to acknowledge my mistakes. The more that I'm open to do that, and the more that I'm willing to do that, I find my relationships get a lot better instantly. I like to be around people that are willing to admit their own mistakes. Some of the most difficult people I've ever had in my life are people who just will not admit that they're wrong, like my ex-spouse. We went through a battle all the time about who's right, who's wrong. At the end of the day, usually it was over something really insignificant and foolish. But at the time, because I have an ego and she had an ego, we would just fight because neither one of us just wanted to admit that we were guilty. And I can own that myself very clearly today. I make a lot of mistakes. Moving on to our next feeling, shame. This is a very, very powerful feeling, and it causes so much damage in our society around us today and other societies around the world. Unexpressed shame or repressed shame causes people to feel self-disgust. It causes them to feel less than being human. And it causes people to feel humiliated. The problem with that is when people feel like that about who they are and they don't express it, they don't acknowledge it, they go out and become pretty awful people. They've shown studies of people that are psychotic, that go out and do heinous crimes. And they repeat those crimes time and time again. They found that those people, they have no ability to feel shame and disgust about themselves. And because if you don't have the ability to feel that feeling, then you're liable to commit whatever act is or acts that are causing you to feel less than human. I always say that shame is something that we're born with, that we have the capacity to feel, but that when we acknowledge it, it gives us humility. It allows us to admit that we're not perfect, that we are imperfect in an imperfect world. It also gives me the ability to accept and to forgive other people because I understand that they're no different than me. I used to think that everybody was better than me. I wouldn't let people know that, but I really thought that I'm the worst. And living like that is being ashamed of who I am, being ashamed. And I had learned growing up also that I was worthless, that I would never amount to anything. I can't tell you how many times I heard you'll never amount to anything. And you ought to be ashamed of yourself. And I took that on. You know, my higher power was saying it, so I took it on. And I believed that. And again, I would cover it up by trying to be perfect at whatever I did in my life. I was successful at every job I ever had, including the military. I advanced more quickly in the military than anybody in my particular field had. In my personal life, I started a construction company. I had never, ever even done construction in my life. When I got out of the military, I'd never been a civilian my entire life. I grew up in a military family, immediately went in after high school in the military. I didn't know what it was like to be a civilian. I had no skills other than training pilots how to do altitude egress from aircraft and how to survive in altitude chambers breathing 100% oxygen. I didn't know anything about real life, so I was terrified. So I went over and I changed to garbage disposal at somebody's house who asked me to. When they asked me to, they said, "Can you do that?" I just agreed. I said, "Yeah, I can do that." That was my ego talking. I'd never changed a garbage disposal my entire life. Well, that garbage disposal change took me to 5 other referrals that those people gave me to do other small little jobs. Next thing I know, I've got 14 people working for me. I own a sizable construction company, remodeling company here in the Valley. I did that for 32 years. And when somebody would ask me to do something, I always said yes. My company motto on the back of all my company shirts said, "Yes, we can do that too." And the reason that I said that is I was too ashamed to say, "No, I don't know how to do that." I was terrified of people thinking that I didn't know what I was doing. So what I would do is I would go to Home Depot or Lowe's, back then it was Home Depot, and I would ask somebody in that department how to put in a toilet or how to put in a sink. And they would tell me how. What I found out is a lot of the Home Depot people that worked in those departments had never done plumbing themselves. And what they were telling me is what they learned on their job. And a lot of times it was wrong. So I was putting in toilets wrong. I was putting in sinks wrong. People were calling me back saying, this is leaking and that's leaking. I was doing electrical problems. They said, I hit this switch and the breaker blows every time. I was like, well, I didn't do that, So I would go to Home Depot and I found out that the people didn't know what they're doing. So I'd get those little books they sell at Home Depot, how to be an electrician or how to be a plumber. And I would take that book. I'd go on a job. I go on the job, they tell me, can you do this? I say, yes. I'd literally go out to my truck and I'd look it up in the book. How do I do this? This is how I built a construction company, from being shame-based, and of course, after a period of time, you learn how to do all those things. And now I'm a handyman. I do all those things. So my thought is that as long as I can address my shame, openly admit it, that I'm feeling ashamed of how I've been living. I'm feeling ashamed of how I've been acting in our relationship. It gives me humility. And it also teaches people that I'm trustworthy. It teaches people to have confidence in me because I'm not a know-it-all and be-all to everything and anybody, except during this presentation, by the way. So, all right, let's move on to the next feeling. Pain. We've all had it, and we all will again have it. It is part of the life experience, as is all these feelings. You cannot escape pain in life. Physical, emotional, spiritual, mental. We receive pain in all forms. The emotional pain that I struggled with from my childhood wreaked havoc on my early relationships in my life and my marriages. It was impossible for me to have a relationship because I was in so much pain from my childhood. And because I wasn't dealing with it, I would act it out. It would come out what's called sideways or passive aggressively. And so because I wasn't dealing with my pain, I was causing other people to suffer. I was causing other people to have agony or discomfort. It wasn't until I began to acknowledge my own pain. And as I said, when I first got into counseling as a client, I spent 20 years in counseling, and I cried like I'd never cried in my entire life. I mean, I literally in some sessions, I would just bawl, heaving, sobbing intensely that I never knew I was capable of. When I was asked to write my story for the big book of Codependence Anonymous many years ago, I went up to the Mogollon Rim, up to a lake, and I took a week off from everything, got away from everybody, and I just wrote for an entire week. I gave what I wrote to Ken and Mary back then, and that became a story that they put in our Codependence Big Book. I was honored to be a part of that book. But what the title of that section, or that little short story there on me, is Men Don't Cry. And I don't know that prior to counseling that I had remembered ever crying, other than when I tried to commit suicide at 11. I remember crying that day as I was ingesting pills that I thought were going to kill me. I thought, this is it, I'm done. I remember crying then. But I learned to not express my crying anymore, because as we were hit and beaten a lot as children, I just cut it off. I said, I'm done. I'm not going to show my emotions. I'm not going to give this person that's hurting me the benefit anymore. And so I cut off my ability to cry. So the problem with not dealing with my pain is I don't grow. I stopped growing emotionally at a very, very young age, 5 or 6 years old. That's when I stopped growing. That's when I was molested and incested. I just shut off completely from feeling pain after that nobody was going to hurt me ever again. And if they did, I wasn't going to show it to them. But it stunted my growth. I stopped growing at that point in time in my life as well. And it made sense when I looked in my 20s as I was going through therapy. I looked at how I was acting. I was acting like a child in my relationships. I was acting like a child at work. And in the crazy things I was doing, the type of parachute jumping that I was doing was crazy. I was doing things in every type of relationship that I had that was coming out of being in pain. But because I wasn't dealing with it, I had to hide it. And the way that I hid it was by just being crazy, just doing stupid things. It wasn't until I started sobbing and crying again that my growth began to happen. I began to grow and mature as an adult man as a result of allowing myself to have pain. To this day, I still am very capable and able and willing to express my pain, whether it's being perpetrated on me or it's because of pain that I created myself in my life and decisions I've made. I will express my pain with someone, whomever is causing the pain, or if it's myself, with my maker and my sponsor. As a result of that, I've been able to continue to grow and recover. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break if we can. Let people use the restroom, relax a little bit, and then we'll get back together and we'll follow up the rest of the hour. Welcome back. So far we've talked about 7 basic feelings and the reason we have them and the purpose that we should express them. I hope that some of you will honor those feelings that you have experienced or do experience and begin expressing them with somebody that's safe and somebody you have some comfortability with. I don't always recommend expressing your deepest emotions and feelings with just anybody. What some of us have experienced, and I know I have personally, especially with my family of origin, that when I felt strong enough to express my deepest feelings about things that have happened or things that were occurring currently or at the time, often I could walk away from there feeling worse than I did when before I shared anything. And so I was cautioned years ago about, if I'm going to express myself and my feelings, make sure that I understand that it is for me, it's not for anybody else. And it is in order for me to get strong and stay strong. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with how those feelings are taken by anybody else. It's important for me, just like it's important for me to eat and drink. It's important for me to express my feelings. When I don't do those things, I begin to have consequences in my life. This next segment, what I'd like to talk about is our personalities. Every single one of us has one, whether we like it or not. Some of us like certain areas of our personalities, and some parts we may not. If you're like me many years ago, that you suffer from self-loathing and self-hatred, I relate to that. I completely understand it. CODA is an incredible opportunity to learn to identify those negative self-feelings and to begin to change those around. There's an old cliche, maybe you've heard it, but I don't believe God created junk. I know that because of the environment that I grew up in and the experiences that I had gone through, I really believed I was junk as a young adult. I really believed that I didn't amount to anything. And so my personality acted that out. You know, I used to do things that were foolish and that were unhealthy. I didn't know how to take care of myself in a healthy manner. And so what I'm going to talk about this next hour is to talk about the 4 human quadrants of our personality, the 4 sections of who we are and what we're about. I like to break them down into these 4 areas. Each one of these areas has been studied ad nauseum by professionals in all kinds of professional groups, from scientists to medical doctors, psychologists, preachers, and numerous other professions have studied these four areas of our life and trying to get a better understanding. Some particular areas that have been studied more than others to see how we tick, how human beings function, what causes us to act in certain ways, is major marketing and advertising companies, including and not limited to casinos, places that want to impact your behavior and have an impact on how you act and the decisions that you make. That is why multi-trillions of dollars is spent every single year on advertising and advertising campaigns. There is a way to control the way people think and act. And if you're not aware of that, unfortunately, you are probably one of those that's being controlled more often than you realize. I'm going to give you an example. The industry of fast food is a multi-trillion-dollar industry worldwide. How did they gain so much success? So much success because their food is so awesome? Maybe some of you think that it is, but the reality is it's some of the cheapest food manufactured. What causes us to go to fast food? Well, they studied that. These corporations have studied what causes the average human being walking down the street, what causes us to be hungry. And what they found out is colors, genuine colors, have a major impact on how we think and feel. An example is every single fast food restaurant company uses red and yellow because they discovered in the 70s that red and yellow causes people to have hunger or to think they're hungry, even if they're not. The colors of red and yellow cause us to have hunger. There's certain other patterns of colors that are used that cause us to be compulsive and obsessive. An example of that is casinos have spent trillions of dollars on finding out how to keep you in the casino and keep you active by studying what colors and sounds and smells and light or darkness, what causes us to want to stay inside of their facility and to use our money to throw it away foolishly. Every single company that is marketing a service or product that is successful has studied this about us, about what makes us tick. And so what I'd like to do is break these four areas down of who we are and talk about each one. The fact is that each four of these quadrants control our personality. They define who we are. What affects that, or what affects each one of these areas is quite varied. Environmental and societal factors affect how each one of these areas is developed as we grow older. And each one of these areas is impacted and develops through our entire lives. They never stop developing. Each component or each part of our personality, it starts at birth and continues its development throughout our life based on where we live, how we live, our faith or lack of faith background, our people that we choose to hang around. It affects everything about us. One thing studies have shown is that 80% of every decision that we make comes from our subconscious. My 20% conscious state wants to believe that I'm in charge. Maybe you can relate to that. Some call it ego, but I want to believe that I'm in charge. And the reality is that 80% of every decision that comes out of my brain starts in my subconscious thought. It is compared to all the environment and all the society and all the other issues that I've been in my life, controls how my decision process is going to be and what decision I'm going to make about any particular thing in my life. And yet again, 20% of me wants to believe, no, I'm in charge. Every single one of these quadrants interacts with each other. They all impact each other. And I'll show you more about that in a moment. As I said and indicated, each one of these areas of our personality has been studied ad nauseum by every professional group that there is. Most every professional group, from psychiatrists and psychologists and professionals that deal with mental health, have studied it because they want to help us improve these areas in our life. Other corporations and other entities that have studied this want to control how we operate our lives. We're going through a whole political campaign right now, and a lot of these areas are studied by the corporations that sponsor politicians. They already know what they're trying to prove and what they're trying to do, and trying to get you to think about who they are, what they are, and make you believe that this is actually what you want. And so I would ask you to step away for a minute and look at all four of these areas when you're making a decision that's going to impact your life, especially greater decisions that are going to affect the way you live and how you live. I want to start with the one that's mental, our mental capacity. Most people don't even understand that our mental capacity is so much more, there's so much more opportunity to be superior in our mental thought that we're not even aware of. They have shown that the brain can handle way much more than we give it. As far as we wonder sometimes how some people, their abilities to do artwork or their abilities to do mathematics are far superior to what I would see in myself. I've seen that a lot in my life, especially with mathematics. Here I am, a contractor, and when it comes to mathematics, I just shy away from. When you start putting letters and numbers together like they do in calculus, I just run. I don't want anything to do with it. So our mental capacity for processing information is beyond comprehension. Our brains are much, much more capable than we give them credit for. However, here's one issue about the mental capacity is that if you don't use it, you lose it. It's just like your muscle groups, the rest of your body. Your body will become apathetic. Your muscles will become weak, much weaker if they're not used, if they're not stimulated. Our mental capacity is no different. If we don't challenge our brains on a regular basis, on a continuous basis, we will begin to lose our mental capacity. We will be in what's called cognitive decline. My grandfather, who was a physician and very, very powerful man, my mother's father, did crossword puzzles until he was 88 years old. But he didn't just do the one out of the paper. He did the one out of 5 or 6 different newspapers. And then he would have a book or 2 or 3 books by his lounge chair where he had all of these other crossword puzzle books. And he would spend hours and hours every single day towards the end of his life in those crossword puzzles, because he said it stimulated his mind and kept him sharp. Until the day that he passed, he was very, very sharp. He had no cognitive decline that was noticeable to anybody. So they've studied, and the studies have shown that our mental capacity is usually beyond what we believe that it is. It's that most of us don't challenge it as much as we could. And there's all kinds of ways to challenge our mental capacity. One of the ways is reading. And I'm not talking about audiobooks. I had a talk with a client recently, and they were talking about, well, I don't like to read. I just like to listen to audiobooks. And it's not that you're not going to get knowledge from that. but your brain is much more challenged when you actually open a book and read. Same is true with mathematics. Challenge your brain with difficult mathematics. So there's different kinds of games, math games that people get involved in that challenges their brain mathematically. Not an area that I spend much time in, but I do love to read. So I learned at a young age that I could actually lose myself in reading and not experience real life for a period of time when I was reading. So it became an escape for me as well. Next area is the physical. Seems pretty simple. If I just exercise a little bit every day, I'll be healthier. I'll maintain my physical body. One of the things that's interesting about our physical health, our physical part of who we are, they've never discovered, to this day, they've never discovered what causes our heart to start beating. From inception, from the first time that it ever beats in our mother's womb, they don't know how it starts. What they do know is that once it starts, it is like every other muscle. It has to be maintained throughout our life. It has to be taken care of. And the more attention that we pay to taking care of ourselves in that capacity, in the physical way, is that our heart lasts longer and works better. The mental capacity, let me jump back here. I jumped ahead a little bit, but for the mental capacity, it's really important to do things in our lives that challenge our mental health. And by challenge it, I mean, if it's reading, if it's learning something new, taking a risk with challenging yourself to do something completely different than you've ever done before, that requires mental thought. It allows your brain to become better equipped as you grow in your life. Physically, as I was about to say, our bodies require workout. And that doesn't mean necessarily that you have to go out and, work at a gym 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day. From my 20s and my 30s, I was what's called a gym rat. I spent hours and hours in the gym working out. I ran 5-6 days a week, 5 or 6 miles easily. I did that for years because I was trained in the military to stay in top physical condition, and I carried that for many years. I had a skydiving accident at 38 years old when my back was broken. And from that time, when I went to Barrows Neurological and had surgery, from that time, I've had all kinds of excuses of why I don't stay in the shape that I used to be in, because my back hurts. Even as I sit here right now, I went to work this morning to get my guys on a job that we're doing, and I could barely get out of bed. I'm really struggling with my back, and I have an MRI next week to find out more about that. But physically, it affects every part of my life when physically I'm not feeling good. Some of you might relate to that, have physical illnesses or physical issues that cause, other areas of your life to be impacted. And so as I work on myself physically, I have to remember to stay within what is reasonable, but at the same time, challenge myself. If I don't challenge myself to be physically active, I begin to lose my physical abilities. And so because of my work, I use the excuse often is, I stay plenty physical at my job. I don't need to do anything outside of that. The reality is my heart, which is a part of my physical being, does not get worked out at my job. Yes, it beats, but it doesn't get worked out like a heart needs to raise the beats per minute over a period of time so that it improves my health. And if I don't challenge myself with that and go out and do it, my body, my heart begins to decline. So it's entirely up to me how I stay, what kind of shape that I stay in physically. I do know that when I'm not in good physical condition, that it affects the other areas of my life. I'll talk about more the interactions of all these in a moment. Emotional. We all have emotions. I think we can acknowledge that, especially if you're in Coda, you can acknowledge that. We've been told very often that we're very emotional people, or worse. My feelings and my emotions are all tied into this quadrant. My ability to express my feelings, my ability to become aware of my feelings are tied into this part of my personality. My emotional health also is preyed upon by other people. If I'm vulnerable and there's people that I have in my life that are not healthy people, which I used to have quite a few of those people in my life, then when I'm vulnerable emotionally is when I'm preyed upon and by unhealthy people. So if I maintain my emotional health, if I express my feelings, if I deal with my emotions, I recognize them and I express them, I become a much more emotionally healthy person. It is when I try to avoid those things that I become emotionally restricted or emotionally depressed. It is extremely important for me to journal. I'll be talking more about that next week, but journaling is an incredible part of my emotional health because I have the 7 feelings. I know them by heart. And when I journal, I talk about those feelings in my journal on a regular basis. 4 or 5 times a week, I write. And I'm not a religious person in the sense that I don't do it every single day, but 4 or 5 times a week, I write. And I find that when I do, I become more aware of what my reality is and more aware of what my decisions are and how my decisions affect me and affect those around me. So I have to be very cognizant of the fact that my emotional health has a lot to do with how I live my life and the actions that I take to improve my life. Spiritual. This area is probably one of the most neglected areas in most people's life, one of the most neglected parts of our personality. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. I think the primary reason is that if you were like me and grew up in a shameful environment, that we don't see ourselves as spiritual beings. Quite the opposite, actually. And it wasn't until my life was awakened in CODA and 12-step recovery programs and doing step work that I began to see that I am a spiritual person, that I go back to the belief that God didn't make any junk and that my spiritual health is as important as any of the other areas. Working on myself spiritually is just as important as working on my heart physically or working on my mental capacity to prevent cognitive decline. So spiritually, journaling is a big part of me staying healthy with my spirituality. I do a lot of reading. I'm very big into reading, not self-help so much anymore, but I like to read about different faiths and people of different faiths and what they've overcome. For me, it very much inspires me. I love watching programs as well as reading about people who've overcome insurmountable obstacles in their life. Recently, I watched one on an individual who lost both his legs in Afghanistan. And it was a documentary on him specifically. And I found myself in tears. I mean, who am I to sit around complaining when you know this guy's story and what he's gone through? And now he's a regular journalist on a national TV program. And he's overcome odds that I've never, ever been faced with. And so that spiritually enlightens me and it gives me a lot of motivation to continue my growth. Spiritual also has a lot to do with my gratitude list. If I recognize in my life all the things I have to be grateful for, and not just the easy things, like I'm grateful I have a house to live in, I'm grateful that I've got good health, and that's real easy, but to categorize those and be much more specific about how I'm grateful, what I'm grateful for. I'm grateful for the health of of my children, and I'm grateful for the relationships that I have with my children. I mean, I can go really into specifics about it, and it's really important for me to do that. I find that spiritually, I'm a much happier person when I recognize my gratitude, when I become aware of the things in my life that I'm grateful for. There's an old saying called count my blessings. You've probably heard it. That's the same thing as a gratitude list that we talk about in recovery. I think, at least for me, what I have found that as long as I am acknowledging the things in my life that I have gratitude for, I'm less likely to slip into disparity or grief. And I'm not talking about grief from loss. I'm talking about grief from my life sucks kind of attitude. I remember in my 20s and 30s all the time, that was a common statement out of my mouth is, my life sucks, life just sucks. And when there was a saying that came out years ago, it became on a t-shirt. It was also put into a movie about Forrest Gump, about shit happens. Can I say that on Zoom? I used to think about that and said, no, my life is shit, right? And that I carried that attitude for the longest time because I lived out that life of being a victim to what my experiences in life had been up to that day. And what I soon found out is my brain believes whatever I tell it. That in the last 2 years, they've come up with some cognitive behavioral research that has shown that your brain will believe whatever you tell it. So when my sponsor years ago, some of you have heard me share this and some of you may have not. I had a sponsor many, many years ago who believed in self-affirmations. And at that time, my sponsor was also a therapist. He was one of the original founders of this program too, but he's passed away many years ago. And him and his wife, Curly and Barb, used to tell me, Curly was my sponsor, and he used to tell me that he believes in affirmations and that affirmations are going to make me feel better about myself. And my first comment to him is, what says that I don't feel good about myself? And he goes, oh, you've proven to me already you don't like yourself. So I thought I hit it pretty well, but apparently I didn't to him. He knew better. And we were very, very similar in the way that we were as far as personalities. But he said, I want you to do this little affirmation for me. He goes, when you get up in the morning, I want you to look in the mirror and I want you to say, I love you 10 times. And I thought that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard of. I don't want to do that, especially I was married at the time and I had a young child. And I was like, what if they catch me? What if they see me looking in the mirror saying, I love you? They're going to think I'm just insane. I didn't know that. I already thought that anyways. So, I went about 2 weeks and he says, so you decided not to do it? And I looked at him, I said, what do you mean I decided not to do it? He goes, well, I know you're not doing it. I says, how do you know? You must ask my wife or something. He goes, no, I didn't talk to nobody. I just know you're not doing it. So then I figured I wouldn't tell him anything else. I figured for another 2 weeks, I was going to do it just to spite him and to see if he said in 2 weeks I still wasn't doing it so I could prove him wrong. Well, for 2 weeks, I did it, but I said it really fast. I looked in the mirror and I tried not to look at myself in the face because that was very difficult. I was shame-based. And I would say, I love you as fast as you could possibly get it out of your mouth. I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. Really fast, but very low tone so nobody else could hear me. And it just, in looking back, it showed me how shame-based I was as far as who I am as a person. The worthlessness was all over me. And so after about 2 weeks, he says, well, you're finally doing it. And I was like, how does he possibly know? I mean, he's got to be talking to my wife or something. And I didn't do it in front of my wife. I made sure she wasn't in the room. So he's got to know. He's got to have some contact. He's got a camera in my bathroom or something. I know that sounds perverse, but there was some way he knew I was doing it. I didn't know that you could read that in my life, that it was so visible. But it was, I was becoming sillier. Just in that short couple of weeks, I was a little bit goofy, a little bit happier, not quite as miserable. And so I guess that's how he told it that I was doing it. He says, I want you to continue, but now I want you to add something to it. I was like, oh no, here we go. So I thought he was going to say, do it 20 times now or something like that. He said, no, just say I love you 10 times and then give yourself a kiss when you're done. And I mean, I literally almost fired him as my sponsor right then. I just thought, this is absolutely insane. I've got a crazy person here as my sponsor. Why would I do that? And he says, well, you can get a different sponsor if you like. You don't have to have me as your sponsor. I was like, all right, fine, I'll do it. So this was very telling to me how shame-based I was. I did say the I love yous 10 times very quickly, very low tone, so nobody could hear me. And I went to, did you know you cannot kiss yourself on the cheek in a mirror? It's not possible. I actually tried. I went to the mirror, I went to kiss myself on the cheek, and I realized that's just not possible. And I hadn't thought it through, but it instantly I had an awakening, a spiritual awakening, if you will, that I was like, I literally will kiss my kids on the mouth, my wife on the mouth, people that I love in my life, I kiss them on the mouth in a heartbeat, no big problem. But yet I couldn't do it for myself. And it's like, I'm expecting other people to love me. I'm expecting other people to feel those powerful feelings for me, and I don't even have them for myself. How can I expect others to have that? That told me a lot about why my relationships were so unsuccessful in my early life, is that I was expecting people to do for me what I could not do for myself and would not do for myself. And so, again, you can see now, probably as I've talked, why I needed 20 years of therapy as a therapist. So as I continued to work on myself and do those little affirmations, they began to work. I remember Saturday Night Live used to have a skit. Maybe some of you remember this way back in the days when Saturday Night Live was actually funny. And and I'd watch this show, and they'd have, I forget who the guy's name was there, but he was doing affirmations. I love myself. And he would do those affirmations, and we would make fun of him. Anybody sitting in the room at the time would say, I would never do that. And I found my years later in the program having to do these affirmations. And I was like, I was so shame-based, I just would never admit that to anybody at the time. But I did those. I began to do those affirmations. And then I developed those affirmations over time for things that I wanted to be. The whole fake it till you make it. My brain will believe what I tell it. So I began to tell my brain, you are likable, you are lovable, you are compassionate, you are a kind person. And I began to do these affirmations, and I slowly, very slowly, but I began to change. I began to believe in these things I was telling myself. I didn't have to say anything negative about myself out loud. My subconscious worked overtime on telling me how lousy and miserable and worthless I was as a person. My actions and my behavior in my life showed that that's the way that I really felt about me. So when I began to challenge myself, it felt really awkward initially doing self-affirmations. It didn't feel real. I didn't believe it in the beginning. It wasn't until doing that for many, many months that I started noticing just some little bit of changes in how I was relating to myself and other people. I began to stop the negative self-talk. And I asked people in my life, including my sponsor back then, if you hear me being down on myself, let me know. Confront me right then. Make me aware of it, because I did it so often. It was a part of my everyday belief system. And I expressed it on a regular basis. I'll never amount to anything. And I didn't say those exact words. I said words that were different, like, God, how stupid were you to do that? Just comments like that. And I made a lot of them. God, I can't believe how stupid I was. I can't believe that I would even think this way. And I was like, I'm living out what I believe in my mind. And so I had to begin to challenge myself about my spiritual beliefs about me, and counting my blessings about how wonderful, my life is compared to what it could be. My early sponsor also said, when you first stopped drinking your alcohol and doing your drugs, just prior to that, you had a choice to be either locked up, covered up, or sobered up. Now you have a job of restoring your brain. There's a reason in our program that the second step talks about restoring us to sanity. You know, we are insane when we come into recovery. And we're insane in the fact that the way we think about ourselves and the life around us is insane thinking. If God doesn't make junk, why am I living a life of acting like junk? Why am I living a life of acting like I'm worthless? I had to begin to change that around. And it was like raising the Titanic. It was really difficult initially. And many times I wanted to give up. Many times I just didn't believe that it was ever going to work. But I spent a whole lot of years learning to think that way. It wasn't going to happen in a couple of months where I was just all of a sudden going to be spiritually awakened and everything in my life was going to be different and all my thoughts were going to be positive. It has taken challenging myself daily in these areas, mentally getting stronger, emotionally getting healthier, physically building my body, taking care of my body, ingesting the right things in my life. I'm a diabetic and I was eating more sugar than 5 people. You know, I had to change the way that I treated myself in all of these areas, spiritually, physically, emotionally, and mentally. And when I began to do that, every single day, each one of those areas impacted each other. Example, if I'm not taking care of myself physically, is it going to affect me emotionally? Is it going to affect me mentally? Absolutely it will. And ultimately, spiritually, I will begin to decline. I will break down if just one of these other areas I'm not focused on or working on. That's why I say they're all interactive, they're all important, and they all need my decision. My journal, as I was mentioned earlier, is specifically about these areas. Where did I challenge myself mentally today? Where did I challenge myself emotionally? Where did I challenge myself physically? And at the end of the week or the end of the month, I can reflect back at that. And if I'm not feeling too good about life, the life around me, I can always go back to my journal and see why. Because right there, it's going to tell me what I've been doing in my life to make myself spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally healthier. And if I'm not working on myself, it begins to decline. If I'm not taking care of any particular muscle group of my body, if I'm not working it, even if it's just a little bit every week, if I'm not working it, it will begin to decline in any of these areas. And if one of those areas begins to decline, it will impact the other areas. If emotionally I'm not being real, I'm not expressing my feelings, then I am not going to take care of myself physically. Why? Why would I want to take care of myself physically if I'm not feeling good about myself emotionally? So they all are interactive. They all need my daily attention. If I'm eating all the wrong foods, if I'm not taking care of putting into my body what my body needs in authentic and genuine ways, what my body needs, not what my brain comes up with, red and yellow make me want to go get that big Jack in the Box jumbo jack, you know, with those fries and all that sounds so good. And then I'll get that slice of cheesecake that they're selling now. And man, and then all of a sudden I wonder why I'm feeling emotionally bad or lousy. So, and then ultimately spiritually, I began to disconnect because if I'm not taking care of myself in all these areas, spiritually, how can I feel spiritual? How can I feel connected to my higher power when I'm treating what he made, which was no junk, as junk? I won't. I will disconnect from my higher power. And that is a terminal illness for me. If I begin to disconnect spiritually, I have a terminal illness. I will begin to die. I may be alive, but I will die from within first. So if I want to live life and be rejuvenated every day, this is my ingredients. This is what I choose to do. This is what I have found out for over the years that works for me. I hope you will be able to find the same thing. I hope all of you will be able to seek out in your own personal lives these 4 areas of your life and to see where you're lacking, and where you can improve. And if you improve one area, it'll begin to improve the other areas. If I just begin to challenge myself mentally, I will begin to develop my esteem, how I feel about me. Emotionally, I will begin to feel better. And if emotionally I begin to feel better, then maybe I'm going to want to do a little bit more physically to take care of myself. And then if I do a little bit more physically, because mentally I'm feeling better and emotionally I'm feeling healthier, then spiritually it automatically will come. I will begin to like who I am again. And that's the first step to me for spirituality, is the relationship that I hold with myself. And if I feel good enough about myself, I know for me, I will look to a higher power to say thank you and express my gratitude. I want to leave an opportunity for anybody to have any questions from my presentation. So I'm just going to open it up at this point and do my best at trying to get any clarification on anything that I've said. Meditation is absolutely imperative. It comes within that spiritual quadrant typically. Without it, I have no spirituality. The meditation for me is combined with journaling, is that when I do journaling, it allows me to get focused on myself, where I'm at, how I'm doing. And so part of my meditation is journaling, and part of my meditation is, doing the self-recognition. And I do that in prayer as well as meditation. They're a combined thing that I do. My meditation is a process that I learned years ago. Actually, it was from my sponsor, and who knew that I had a hard time of sitting still with myself. When I would do that, my mind would take over and it would become a negative reflection versus, a spiritual reflection. And so my meditation includes conversing with myself in a very positive manner, acknowledging my imperfection, but acknowledging that I'm perfect, in that, again, God didn't make any junk kind of contemplation. I believe that my meditation involves me thinking through my day and clearly seeing how I was in that day. And then my journaling is a part of putting that down in written form. My prayer is very, very simple. I've kept my prayers very, very simple most of my recovery, and where that it is just about recognizing my gratitude for what my higher power has done in my life. And then in the morning, asking for his will be done again. I keep it that simple. I have a very strong belief about this because it's very personal to me, as well as a clinician for so many years, and helping people do trauma resolution. I found it to be very, very successful. And that process is that I have to recognize the signs and symptoms of being a trauma survivor is. For instance, as a military person, the VA has a department that specifically deals with post-traumatic stress disorder. Whenever there's childhood abuse, that person can get a diagnosis quite easily that is PTSD related, because there's trauma and abuse that happens that gets repressed. And as a result of that repression, PTSD becomes the diagnostic formulation for dealing with that. My belief is that I need professional help to deal with trauma resolution. If I don't get that professional help with somebody who's competent in dealing specifically with those issues, that I end up becoming very emotionally sick and destructive. That is what trauma does to me. Much like a veteran of war goes through horrible nightmares, goes through reliving that trauma in their life, throughout their life, until they confront it. The same is true for somebody who grows up in an abusive and traumatic childhood. Until that is confronted, I don't believe you can just forget it and hope that it goes away. It will impact your life in many ways. In some of those areas, you may not even know that it's impacting your life. I think 12 steps is something that is extremely beneficial to have in your life when you go through trauma therapy. I don't know, I'm not sure that I believe totally that they have to both coincide, but I do believe they both have to be confronted. If there's an addiction in somebody's life, especially if it's an active addiction, whether it be to people or things or substances, that addiction must be under control in order for trauma therapy to be effective and to work. What typically happens is a lot of people will seek trauma therapy, not be in a 12-step program, and actually regress, get worse in their life, and become more dysfunctional and more destructive. So that's why I think a 12-step program is very, very helpful. But I don't know that they have to necessarily coincide. I just find that it's extremely beneficial if they do. As far as the VA, I know the VA in Phoenix, it's only been a few years. It's not been too many years that they've actually structured programs specifically for dealing with PTSD, but mostly it's with war veterans and not childhood trauma. But I find that finding therapists that are competent and educated in trauma resolution are the best people to seek out when you begin to deal with years and years of painful trauma. I think identifying where the pain comes from, what that pain is about, is really important. Recognition is the first part of any growth. So I think recognizing where it comes from and then determining whether or not it's something that you want to try to resolve on your own, by yourself, or without a therapist. Sometimes I think a therapist is extremely helpful to confront those issues. You're very welcome. Thank you for being here.